Look at these three flags: Denmark, Norway, Sweden. Three separate countries, three separate governments, three separate identities. And yet, if you look closely enough, you'll notice something strange. The same cross on every single one. That isn't a coincidence. These three nations didn't just share a neighborhood. They shared a language, they shared a mythology, they shared blood. For centuries, they invaded one another, fought so many wars that historians eventually stopped counting them one by one. And yet, through all of it, they could never quite let go of each other. Scandinavia isn't really a collection of countries, it's a family, one that spent 1,000 years arguing over who should sit at the head of the table. Welcome to the Meridian. Today, we're uncovering how one people slowly became three nations, and why the North still carries the scars of that breakup. Here's what's strange. If you met a Viking from Denmark and another from Norway 1,000 years ago, they could probably hold a conversation without needing a translator. They worshipped the same gods, sailed the same ships, shared many of the same laws, raised their children in a remarkably similar culture. Odin wasn't Danish, Thor wasn't Swedish. The Norse world belonged to all of them. They shared the same runic alphabet, the same sagas, the same values: honor, family, reputation, the gods, the sea. They were not one kingdom, but they were one people in a cultural sense. So if they had so much in common, why didn't they become one country? That question would shape Northern Europe for the next 1,000 years. Long before there was Norway, before Sweden, before Denmark, there was simply the North, a harsh landscape of frozen seas, towering mountains, dense forests, and scattered kingdoms. The sea connected these communities far more than the land separated them. Merchants crossed the Baltic, warriors crossed the North Sea. Stories traveled faster than borders ever could. Old Norse echoed from Iceland to the Swedish forests. What united them wasn't a government. It was a shared way of seeing the world. Honor, family, reputation, the gods, the sea. Together, they formed what historians often describe as the Norse cultural world. They were not one kingdom, but they were one people in a cultural sense. Eventually, someone decided culture wasn't enough. The North should have one crown. That someone was a woman. In 1397, a Danish queen named Margaret the First did something that no Viking chieftain, no Danish king, no Swedish warlord had ever managed to do. She united all three kingdoms under a single crown. Denmark, Norway, Sweden, one monarch, one crown, one union. History remembers it as the Kalmar Union. For the first time, almost the entire Scandinavian world stood beneath a single ruler. On paper, it looked unstoppable, but maps have a habit of hiding the cracks beneath them, because while the kingdoms shared a culture, they didn't always share the same ambitions. Denmark believed leadership was its birthright. Sweden believed strength mattered more than tradition. Norway stood quietly between them. Margaret held it together through sheer political genius. But when she died in 1412, the cracks began to widen. The family had a crown. What it didn't have was agreement on who deserved to wear it. For the next 100 years, the Kalmar Union tore itself apart. Sweden rose up against Danish dominance again and again. Each time, Denmark crushed the rebellion. Each time, the resentment grew deeper. Then came the moment that made reconciliation almost impossible. In November 1520, the Danish King Christian II invited the Swedish nobility to Stockholm for a celebration, a peace offer, a new beginning. Or so they were told. What followed became known as the Stockholm Bloodbath. Over 3 days, more than 90 Swedish nobles, bishops and citizens were executed. The streets ran red. Christian II thought he had ended the Swedish problem. Instead of ending Swedish resistance, it ignited it. A young Swedish nobleman named Gustav Vasa escaped the executions. He rallied the Swedish people. And in 1523, Sweden broke free from the Kalmar Union permanently. The family had broken apart. Sweden had won its freedom. Denmark kept its crown. Norway had neither, not because it chose to, but because history chose for it. Norway was too small, too divided, and too dependent on Danish trade to stand alone. It remained tied to Denmark. For nearly 3 more centuries, the three siblings were now walking separate paths, but they were far from finished with one another. What followed was one of the most intense rivalries in European history. Sweden and Denmark fought war after war. Border after border was redrawn. And then, in the early 1600s, Sweden did something extraordinary. It became a great power, Swedish armies swept across the Baltic. At the Battle of Breitenfeld in 1631, Sweden humiliated the forces of the Holy Roman Empire. By dawn, the Swedish army was outnumbered. By sunset, it had suffered one of its greatest defeats. The younger brother had overtaken the family. But ambition has a price. In 1709, at the Battle of Poltava, Sweden's King Charles XII led his exhausted army against Russia and lost everything. Sweden's age as a great power ended in the Russian snow. Meanwhile, Norway's story took one final turn. During the Napoleonic Wars, Denmark chose the wrong side. As punishment, Norway was handed to Sweden. But in 1814, before the handover was complete, Norwegians did something extraordinary. They drafted their own constitution, one of the most liberal in Europe. 3 nations, separate governments, separate destinies, and yet the same cross on every flag. Walk through Scandinavia today and you'll see 3 independent, thriving nations. Distinct languages, distinct cultures, distinct pride. And yet, a Dane can understand a Norwegian can understand a Swede. They can read each other's literature, share each other's humor, and navigate each other's cities without missing a beat. They built the world's most prosperous societies, not by erasing their differences, but by learning from them. Because the truth about Denmark, Norway, and Sweden is simple. They tried being one country, and it broke them. So they chose something far stronger, being a family. Today, through the Nordic Council, they share open borders, integrated economies, and absolute defense cooperation. No crowns required. They didn't become one country because they didn't have to. The North was already whole. This is the Meridian. Subscribe, because the most powerful borders in history aren't the ones drawn on maps. They're the ones drawn inside families. We follow the lines that change the world.